Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I have been waiting all week for this one because it is the rare AI paper that quietly reframes a question most people assumed was already settled decades ago.
That is a big opening claim, so let's set the table properly before we get carried away. What is the paper, who wrote it, and why did it land on your desk this week?
It is called Extreme Event Aware Learning, published in Nature Communications on August 20th of 2026. It comes out of MIT from graduate student Kai Chang and Professor Themis Sapsis, who sits in mechanical and ocean engineering rather than in any machine learning lab.
So walk me through the problem they set out to solve, because on the surface, AI and weather prediction feels like a solved and frankly crowded field at this point in the cycle.
That is the trap, and it is worth being precise. This is not forecasting. Forecasting asks what happens Tuesday. This asks a completely different question, which is, what is the worst thing that could plausibly happen? Even though it never actually has. Think of it as a stress test generator for engineers rather than a forecaster.
And historically, how have engineers answered that question? Bridges and levees have been designed against 100-year events for a very long time, well before any of this technology existed anywhere.
They looked backward. You take the historical record, fit a statistical curve to it, and extrapolate the tail. That works reasonably well when your record actually contains a few genuine disasters to anchor the curve you are fitting.
But that is exactly where I get nervous, because the record is short, and the climate that produced that record is not necessarily the climate we are designing infrastructure for over the next 80 years.
You just stated the whole problem in one sentence. Chang put it bluntly in the MIT write-up. He said the existing methods assume there are very disastrous events that we have already seen in the dataset.
So how does their method get around that? My instinct is that you cannot conjure information out of nothing. If the extreme is not in the data, where exactly is it coming from?
This is the elegant part, and it hinges on splitting the problem into two ingredients that are usually tangled together. The first ingredient is what they call point statistics, and the second is spatial structure.
Break those down for me, because I think a lot of listeners hear statistics and spatial structure and immediately tune out. Give me the version I could explain to a friend over dinner without a whiteboard.
Point statistics is just how often each intensity level shows up at a single location over a long stretch of time. How frequently does one spot get 10 millimeters, or 50, or 200? That is a curve you can build from a long, boring record.
Right, and that curve does not require you to have witnessed a disaster. It just requires you to have watched one place patiently for a very long time and counted what actually happened there.
Exactly. The second ingredient, the spatial map, is about shape. Rain does not fall uniformly. It has a footprint, a geometry, bands and cores and edges, and that geometry follows physical rules a model can learn from ordinary storms.
So one ingredient tells you how hard it can rain, and the other tells you what a rainstorm actually looks like laid out across a map. And the entire trick is in combining them correctly.
That is the idea in a sentence. The algorithm learns the correspondence between coarse resolution and fine resolution maps, then uses the statistical constraints to steer the generator toward intensities the spatial training data never contained.
Now here's the number that stopped me cold when I read the methodology section. They had 25 years of hourly precipitation data covering the continental United States, and they deliberately trained the spatial model on only the first 6 months of it.
6 months. That is the number. And 6 months of precipitation over the continental United States contains essentially nothing you would call a historic extreme. It is an intentionally impoverished training set, and that is the whole point.
Why would you handicap yourself like that? That feels like the sort of thing a reviewer would flag immediately as an unrealistically small sample for a problem at continental scale.
Because it is the proof. If you train on 25 years, including several real disasters and then generate a disaster, a skeptic says you simply memorized it. Training on 6 months of ordinary weather removes that objection entirely.
That is a far more honest experiment than I expected, and it genuinely changes how I read the headline result. So what did it actually produce once they turned the thing loose?
Rainfall maps with maximum intensities around 300 millimeters. For context, the highest rainfall figure on record for New York City sits at roughly 200 millimeters, so this is a storm half again as intense as anything the city has ever logged.
That is roughly 12 inches of rain for anyone thinking in imperial units, which is a genuinely apocalyptic number for a dense city with a drainage system designed generations ago for a different climate.
And crucially, it does not produce one map. It produces thousands of realizations differing in footprint, coverage, and intensity, all consistent with whatever statistical frequency you asked it for when you posed the question.
Sapsis framed the motivation in a line I keep turning over in my head. He asks what will be the Katrina that happens every 100 years, and how bad will it be?
That framing is deliberate, and the arithmetic underneath it matters. Events on the scale of Katrina land roughly every 30 to 40 years. The 100-year version of that storm has simply never been observed by anybody alive today.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because there is an obvious objection here, and I do not think we should skate past it. A generative model producing convincing images of things that never happened is, in almost every other context we cover on this show, exactly what we call a hallucination.
Because a hallucination is unconstrained, and this is constrained at both ends. The spatial physics comes from real observed maps, and the intensity distribution comes from 25 years of real point measurements. It is interpolating between two firmly anchored things.
So the claim is not that this specific storm will happen on this specific date. The claim is that a storm of roughly this shape and this severity is statistically admissible, given everything we already know.
That is exactly the claim, and it is far more modest than most headlines suggest. Sapsis said putting a probability on an event that has not happened yet is now a question of national and economic resilience.
Which brings me to the counterpoint I wanted to raise, because there's another piece of research circulating right now that seems, at first glance, to cut in precisely the opposite direction.
You mean the science advances work that Carbon Brief covered? And I'm glad you raised it, because putting those two studies side by side is where this whole conversation gets genuinely interesting.
Give me the shape of that study, because, as I understand it, the conclusion was fairly unflattering toward the leading AI weather systems, precisely when the stakes were at their highest.
It tested GraphCast from Google DeepMind, Pangu Weather from Huawei Cloud, and Fuxi from a Shanghai team against the high-resolution system from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts.
And the test set was record-breaking events specifically, rather than ordinary weather, which strikes me as the correct way to probe whether these systems can generalize past what they were trained on.
Roughly 160,000 heat records, 33,000 cold records, and 53,000 wind records from the year 2020, all of which broke marks set between 1979 and 2017.
And the AI systems lost, which is uncomfortable because those same systems beat the physics-based models comfortably on routine forecasting, and that is the part most of the coverage tends to celebrate.
They lost, and the failure had a very telling shape. The performance gap widened the further a record was broken, and it also widened at shorter lead times, which is precisely when a warning matters most.
That is the worst possible failure profile you could design. The model is most wrong exactly when the event is most severe, and the window for acting on any warning is smallest.
One author called it a warning shot against retiring physics-based forecasting too early, and I think that is the right posture. But notice carefully that it does not actually contradict the MIT work at all.
Explain why not. Because on a quick read, they genuinely sound like they are saying opposite things about whether these systems can handle events sitting outside their training distribution.
Because the forecasting models are asked to predict a specific event on a specific day, and they fail because that event sits outside their learned distribution. The MIT method never claims to know when. It only claims to know what is possible and how often.
Let's talk about who actually uses this, because a Nature Communications paper is one thing, and a change in how a real city builds a real drainage system is something else entirely.
The team names several targets directly, testing a seawall against a storm surge nobody has recorded, checking grid resilience under a heat wave beyond the historical peak, and staging firefighting resources for a wildfire season with no precedent.
The grid example is the one I find most immediately pressing, given how much new load is being added to systems that were designed against a temperature record which no longer describes the climate.
And the method is not restricted to weather at all, which I think gets badly undersold in the coverage. Sapsis explicitly points at financial market crashes and robotic navigation as domains with exactly the same underlying structure.
Unpack the finance connection for me, because that seems like a stretch until you actually think about what a market crash is from a purely statistical point of view.
It is the identical problem. You have a long record of ordinary daily moves, a small handful of genuine crashes, and every risk model in existence struggles to price the crash that is larger than anything sitting in the sample.
In the robotics case, I would not naturally have grouped autonomous navigation with hurricanes and market crashes, but I suspect the logic is about rare failure conditions rather than the domain itself.
Exactly that. A self-driving system needs testing against the once-in-a-decade road situation, and you cannot possibly collect enough real-world miles to encounter it. Generating plausible rare scenarios becomes the only tractable path forward.
Now give me the honest limitations, because I do not want to leave listeners with the impression that this is a finished product they can download tomorrow and point at any hazard they like.
The main constraint is that you need both ingredients for each specific hazard. You need relevant point statistics, and you need spatial data appropriate to that phenomenon, and those are not equally available across every domain or every region.
Which means precipitation was a favorable first test case. Because the United States has an unusually dense and long-running observational network compared with most of the rest of the world.
That is fair, and it raises an equity question worth naming out loud. The places most exposed to catastrophic weather are frequently the places with the thinnest historical observation records, which is precisely where a method like this would help most.
The funding line also caught my attention because it says something about who is paying close attention to this problem and why they apparently consider it urgent right now.
It came through a Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, which tells you this is being read as a national resilience problem, rather than purely as an academic curiosity.
So what should our listeners actually watch for over the next few months and know whether this becomes real practice rather than an interesting result sitting quietly in a very good journal?
Watch whether any engineering standards body or insurance catastrophe modeler picks it up. Design codes and catastrophe models are where a method like this either changes real decisions or politely stays in the literature forever.
That feels like exactly the right test. Not benchmark scores, not a slick demo, but whether somebody sizing a stormwater system in a real city actually changes the number they design against.
And if I can leave one thought, it is that the interesting frontier right now may not be systems that answer our questions faster. It may be systems that let us reason carefully about things that have never once happened.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.